Okay, so you know how sometimes a tragedy happens so fast, like in a flash of violence, and someone ends up losing their life?
Yeah.
But does the law always have to view that, as the absolute worst kind of crime? Or are there, like, shades of gray? Are there times when intent and the situation matter?
Right.
Well, today we're digging into this really intense Supreme Court case. It all started with a truly awful incident that happened at a dance in Latay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you actually sent us some info on this case about Dexter Aspa Albino and a man who died, Marlon Dianzon Soriano.
Oh, right. Yeah, that one was pretty fascinating.
It really makes you think about how the Philippine justice system works, especially when it comes to deciding if someone meant to kill or if it happened in the heat of the moment. What do you think?
For sure. This case, People of Philippines v. Dexter Aspa Albino, GR No 229928, July 22, 2019. It really gets to the heart of how our courts separate the most serious charges, like premeditated murder, from situations where it might not be so clear-cut.
Okay, so let's paint the picture for everyone listening. It's May 10th, 2009. We're in Kirigara. Late. It's late, almost 12:45 in the morning.
Really late.
There's a benefit dance going on. People are out, probably having a good time. Sounds like a pretty normal community event, right?
Yeah, sounds like it.
But, well, things took a really dark turn.
Oh, no. What happened?
So the reports say that there was some bad blood between Dexter Aspa Albino's group and some other folks who were at the dance.
Oh, so like a rivalry or something.
Yeah, something like that. And sadly, it escalated. Like whatever was brewing between them boiled over and spilled outside.
Outside the dance?
Exactly, away from the music and the crowd. That's where things got really bad.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, Marlon Dianzon Soriano and his brother Jerome, they saw what was happening and tried to intervene, tried to break things up, be peacemakers.
It's so sad that it backfired.
It really is. Instead of calming things down, it seems like it just triggered a huge burst of violence.
Oh.
Based on what Jerome Soriano and a neighbor named Arwin Tirado said, Dexter Aspa Albino just suddenly pulled out a gun. A revolver.
A revolver, wow.
Yeah, and without a word, shot Marlon right in the chest.
Oh my gosh. That's terrible.
It was a devastating, split-second act that changed everything.
So what happened to Marlon?
He was rushed to the hospital, but tragically, he didn't make it. The gunshot wound was just too severe.
That's just awful. And they're sure it was Albino who fired the shot.
Both Jerome and Arwen were absolutely certain. They identified Albino as the shooter.
So open and shut case there.
Right. Well, as you might expect, Albino and his lawyers, they painted a very different picture of what went down that night.
Oh, really? What did they say?
Their whole argument was basically that Jerome was the one who started it, that he had threatened Albino's group and even attacked Albino. Albino claimed that during the fight, he felt something sharp against his back, then the gunshot, and then he saw Marlon on the ground.
So he's saying he didn't do it.
He claims he never saw who actually fired the gun.
Interesting. Did anyone back up his story?
Yeah, there was another witness, a guy named Pablo Flores, who supported Albino's version of events. So as you can see, it was a messy situation with totally conflicting stories. It's the classic he said scenario.
I see. So it fell to the courts to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. And you've got these two completely different narratives about this violent, chaotic moment. So let's break down what happened next. What was the first ruling in this case?
Okay, so the first stop was the Regional Trial Court in Carragher Light, specifically Branch 13.
And what did they decide?
They sided with the prosecution. They found Dexter Aspa Albino guilty of murder.
Wow, murder.
Yeah, and the court really leaned on the eyewitness testimony of Jerome Soriano and Arwin Tirado. They were the ones who placed Albino at the scene with the gun and identified him as the shooter.
But didn't they initially just arrest him for homicide?
Yeah, but the judge decided that the killing was actually murder because of the element of treachery. They said that the way the shooting happened so suddenly and unexpectedly meant that Marlon had zero chance to defend himself.
I see.
So because of that, Albino was sentenced to Reclusion Perpetua. That's life imprisonment in the Philippines. Plus, he was ordered to pay a lot of money to Marlon's family. Civil indemnity, moral damages, exemplary damages, and actual damages.
So a pretty significant financial burden on top of the prison sentence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, though. The prosecution tried to argue that using an unlicensed firearm should be seen as an aggravating factor.
Oh, to make the sentence even harsher.
Exactly. But the court said there wasn't enough evidence to prove that the gun was unlicensed, so they didn't factor that in.
Okay, so a guilty verdict and a life sentence, that's pretty heavy.
It is. But of course, Albino appealed the decision.
Naturally. So where did the case go next?
Up to the Courts of Appeals.
And what did they have to say about the regional trial court's ruling?
Well, the Court of Appeals basically agreed with the lower court. They upheld the murder conviction and agreed that treachery was involved.
So no change there.
Not really.
Yeah.
They did add a couple of things to the sentence, though. They specified that Albino wouldn't be eligible for parole.
Meaning he would have to serve the entire life sentence.
Right. And they also said that all those financial penalties, all those damages he had to pay, they'd start accruing interest at 6% per year from the day their decision became final.
Oh, wow. So the penalties just kept getting more severe.
Yeah, it's like a snowball effect.
Uh-huh.
So now we have two courts both saying Albino's guilty of murder, and that sets the scene for the Supreme Court stepping in. This case had some big questions that needed to be answered, at the highest level of the legal system.
Exactly. And it really all boils down to one key legal question, right?
Yeah, the big one. Was the Court of Appeals right to uphold that murder conviction?
Especially focusing on whether or not treachery was actually part of the crime.
You got it. Because if they decided there was no treachery, that could change everything. The conviction could be downgraded to homicide.
And homicide carries a much lighter sentence than murder.
Huge difference. And this is where, all the complexities of the law come into play. It's not always black and white. There are so many fine distinctions, and it's the Supreme Court's job to make sure those distinctions are applied correctly.
Absolutely. So no pressure or anything, but what did the Supreme Court decide in this case?
Well, after they looked at everything, all the evidence and the arguments, the Supreme Court made a pretty big move. They actually granted the appeal.
They sided with Albino.
In a way, yeah. They overturned the murder conviction and found Dexter Aspa Albino guilty of homicide instead.
Wow, a pretty major shift.
Definitely. And the whole decision, it really hinged on a very particular understanding of what treachery means, legally speaking.
Yeah.
Justice Lazaro Javier, who wrote the decision, she made it clear that the shooting being sudden, that in itself isn't enough to say definitively that it was treachery.
Right, because you can imagine someone impulsively lashing out without really planning it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court really stressed that to be legally considered treachery, the person committing the crime has to have deliberately and consciously chosen a method of attack that guarantees they can pull it off without any risk to themselves. Like, they've thought about it and chosen a way to make sure the victim can't fight back.
To ensure they're not in danger.
Yeah. And in this case, they argued that because there was already a fight going on, even though Albino's actions were definitely violent, it looked more like something he did in the heat of the moment, reacting to the chaos.
Not some cold, calculated plan to kill.
Right. It wasn't like he had planned this out beforehand, picking that exact moment and method to make sure he could kill Marlon without facing any consequences.
So the Supreme Court was saying there was enough doubt to question whether he had really intended to commit murder with, full premeditation.
Exactly. And there's another interesting detail here. Remember how the attack happened from the front?
Right, not from behind or anything.
Well, the Supreme Court pointed that out, too. While a frontal attack doesn't automatically mean it can't be treachery, it does suggest that, the victim might have had a chance, even a small one, to see it coming and maybe try to defend himself.
So that adds to the uncertainty about whether it was a truly treacherous act, in the legal sense.
Exactly. Plus, the Supreme Court even brought up other cases like People v. Pilpa and People v. Tugboat Jr. to support their interpretation of what treachery means.
Sure that this wasn't just a random decision they made up?
Yeah, there's precedent for this kind of thinking. So, since the Supreme Court wasn't convinced that treachery was a factor, they changed the conviction from murder to homicide.
Okay, that makes sense. But even though it's a lesser crime, there's still a punishment, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For the homicide conviction, the Supreme Court gave Albino what's called an indeterminate sentence.
Indeterminate? What does that mean?
So basically, it means he got a range of time. The minimum he has to serve is 8 years of prison mer, and the maximum is 14 years, 8 months, and 1 day of reclusion temporal.
Wow, quite a range. Why do they do that, give a range instead of a fixed number of years?
It's kind of giving the person a chance to, prove themselves. The idea is that if Albino shows good behavior in prison, participates in rehabilitation programs, that kind of thing, he could be eligible for parole before he serves the full maximum sentence.
So it's like a built-in incentive for good behavior.
Exactly.
Interesting. Now, what about all the money Albino was ordered to pay, all those damages? Did the Supreme Court change any of that?
They did. Because the charge was changed to homicide, the financial penalties had to be adjusted too.
To fit the lesser crime.
Exactly. So they lowered both the civil indemnity and the moral damages. Those were originally 75,000 pesos each, but the Supreme Court reduced them to 50,000 pesos each.
A significant reduction.
Yeah. And remember those exemplary damages?
A lot of the ones meant to be like a punishment.
Yeah, well, since they couldn't prove treachery, those were totally taken off the table. But the Supreme Court did award 50,000 pesos in temperate damages instead.
Now, refresh my memory. What are temperate damages again?
They're kind of a catch-all for when there's definitely some financial loss, but it's hard to put an exact number on it, like, funeral expenses. There might not be receipts for every single thing.
So it's a way to make sure the family is compensated fairly, even if they can't prove every single peso they spent.
Exactly. And just like before, all these amounts, they'll start accruing interest at 6% per year from the day the Supreme Court's decision becomes final.
Wow, so much to unpack with this case. It really brings some core legal concepts to the forefront.
It does.
We should probably break some of those down for our listeners. Let's start with the big one, treachery. It played such a central role in the whole case.
It did. So to put it in simple terms, treachery basically means that someone commits a crime, specifically a crime against a person, in a way that's designed to make absolutely sure they can get away with it.
They use a method that eliminates any risk to themselves.
Exactly. Like they plan it out, they choose a time and a method that leaves the victim totally defenseless, unable to fight back. And this case, People of the Philippines v. Dexter Aspa Albino really highlights how crucial it is to prove that this conscious choice of method, this deliberate planning, was a factor. Otherwise, it might not meet the legal definition of treachery.
And without treachery, the crime can't be considered murder.
Right. It becomes homicide.
So tell us, legally speaking, what is homicide?
Homicide is when someone kills another person unlawfully. But the key difference between homicide and murder is that with homicide, there aren't those specific super serious circumstances present.
Like treachery.
Yeah, treachery, or things like evident premeditation, cruelty, or using poison. If those are part of the killing, it bumps it up to murder.
Got it. Now, we also heard about this thing called an indeterminate sentence law.
Oh.
Why is that so important in cases like this?
Well, the indeterminate sentence law is all about rehabilitation.
Trying to give people a chance to turn their lives around.
Yeah, so the law says that when someone's convicted of a crime, the judge has to give them a sentence with a minimum term and a maximum term. And the idea is that the person can potentially get out on parole before they serve the entire maximum sentence.
If they behave well and show they're making progress.
Exactly. So it's a way to encourage good behavior and give people hope that they can reintegrate into society.
Okay, that makes sense. And lastly, let's touch on those different kinds of damages. We heard about civil indemnity, moral damages, exemplary damages, and temperate damages.
It's going to be kind of confusing, keeping them all straight.
Can you break it down for us?
Sure. So civil indemnity, that's the most basic one. It's basically compensation for the loss of life itself, like acknowledging the inherent value of a human life.
Makes sense. What about moral damages?
Those are about the emotional impact, the pain and suffering the family goes through when they lose someone. It's meant to compensate them for that intangible loss.
And exemplary damages?
Those are more about punishing the offender. It's like making an example of them and deterring others from doing the same thing. You usually only see those if there's an aggravating circumstance like treachery in the crime.
And those were removed in this case because the Supreme Court overturned the treachery finding.
Exactly. And then you have temperate damages.
The ones we talked about earlier, when you can't prove the exact amount of money lost.
Yeah, like with funeral costs. It's a way to make sure the family gets some compensation for those kinds of expenses, even if they don't have receipts for every single thing.
Okay, so we've gone through the whole story. We've talked about what happened that night at the dance in Leyte, how the case moved through the courts, and what the Supreme Court ultimately decided in the part. People of the Philippines v. Dexter Aspa Albino. It's been quite a ride.
It really has.
What are your takeaways from all this? What does this case tell you about how the Philippine legal system tackles these really tough, nuanced cases involving violence? Did going through all this make the difference between murder and homicide, especially when it comes to this idea of treachery, any clearer for you?
It definitely made me think. I mean, this case shows how carefully the courts have to look at these situations. They don't just look at the act itself. They consider the intent behind it, the specific circumstances, everything. And sometimes, like in this case, it can lead to a huge change in the outcome.
That's so true. It's a reminder that there's a lot of depth and complexity to the law. It's not always about just punishing the act, but also understanding the motivations and context.
For sure. In this case, People of the Philippines v. Dexter Aspa Albino, GR noun 229928, July 22, 2019. It drives home how important it is to have a legal system that can handle these kinds of difficult questions.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear what you think about all this. Leave your comments below and hit that favorite button if you found this deep dive into the Supreme Court case interesting.
And if you're fascinated by these kinds of legal deep dives, make sure you subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We're always exploring new cases and legal issues that, really matter. Cases that shape how we understand justice and how our society functions.
We'll see you in our next deep dive.